The goal of this webinar is to introduce some best practices in modeling with BPMN that will allow us to increase compliance with the BPMN 2.0 specification, gain consistency across process models, and improve the quality and precision of the artifacts being created. We're going to focus specifically on three areas: the organizational structure in the project browser, the use of common shared artifacts, and also some modeling techniques. So if we take a look at the project browser, you notice that the structure is divided into two main sections. At the top there you see catalogs and then process views. So catalogs contain the shared reusable elements. You can define catalogs at multiple levels: globally for the entire enterprise, at the project level, at the product level, etc. So the structure that you're going to see here in a second being opened could be repeated multiple times across your repository. Right, so here's that section. So if we actually open up, the first thing we're seeing there is data objects. So data objects are commonly used across business boundaries, business processes, so it makes sense to define them only once. This will also help later in our design, where these objects can be traced to, for example, UML elements, perhaps XML schemas, etc. So elements that describe the actual data structure as opposed to their abstract representation in BPMN. So likewise, error events that can occur across processes can be defined globally. And of course, the same is true for business escalation events, which is our next package down there. Now, the lanes that we use to segment our internal processes can be predefined as well, especially in relation to the roles that these lanes represent. So the next folder down there is the roles. So you have two lanes, two roles. Now, if we open up the lanes diagram, you're going to see two lanes that are pre-configured, production and sales. And one way to gain consistency is by using a preset color scheme. So for example, sales will always have this yellow background. And then anytime we use the production lane in one of our models, it's going to be off-white. But more importantly, the lane is tied to a predefined role via this partition element ref tag value that you see there. Right, so logically, the production lane, which graphically represents the role, will always have this link to the role definition, right, across all our process models. And so for every template lane, there should be a corresponding role. Right, the role can represent human activities. It could be a department, like in this example, or an organization within the company. So BPMN doesn't really predefine what a lane and a role map to. Now if we scroll down a little bit and look at messages, messages by definition cross pools and therefore process boundaries. And so they're just prime candidates for a global definition and for reuse whenever we need them. Now, pools are similar to lanes. They are the graphical representation of business participants. So if we formally define all the participants of our business domain, like you see here, right, we can tie them to the pools. Of course, if we look at the diagram, the pools can be color-coded just as well. Right? The participant name could be the official title, but the pool itself can use a different naming convention. So for example, the value-added reseller participant that we see there corresponds to a pool named reseller. And you could change the name again in a specific diagram. So it's the formal participant to pool link that you see in the tag values in the lower right corner there that allows us not to rely on naming conventions when we run the reports later on. Now, if we look at business rules and conditions, those can be, of course, predefined as well. And the same thing would be true for signals, business milestone events. So all these things could be predefined. But there is a key component of a reusable library that consists of business processes, or in this example here, the validate order case, it's just a reusable sub-process. So those make perfect sense to define globally. So overall, this represents our catalog of reusable elements, which we could then leverage inside the business processes that we define. Now, before we examine the business process example that I have here, I want to draw attention to how process models can be structured inside Enterprise Architect. So, first of all, we recommend that you create a package that encloses every top-level business process, like in this case, change order request. Why? Well, the package will provide you with a starting point for documentation generation and also for baselining. In addition, it can give you a control point for setting security locks and applying version control. So all of those are features in Enterprise Architect that are dependent upon the existence of a package. So secondly, if we actually see the business process element, change order request there, a little bit further down, we suggest that you encapsulate every process inside such a business process object. So the business process, you see it there. That is the first element in your toolbox, in the business process toolbox. And by doing that, this is going to allow you to reference the entire process as a single unit. For example, for traceability to requirements, mapping to use cases and other model artifacts, where you want the mapping to be at the process level itself and not to one of the detailed steps, for example. So in this model, you see there are 3 data objects associated with this business process element. The reseller customer there. Now these objects are defined, of course, in the reusable catalog section. So by using data associations to relate them to the process, what you're doing is declaring that these data objects are available throughout the process. You don't need to go and explicitly drag them into the diagrams again later on. They are globally available across this process. Now if we drill down inside the process element, you're going to see a diagram with 3 pools. Those pools are cloned from the pool definitions that we saw in our reusable catalog. There they are. And then the lower pool contains the production lane, so the single lane, that will represent our internal business process domain. And it has interactions with the VAR and customer outside participants through their pools. Now in this example, the process steps that are assumed to occur within these external entities are actually modeled out, but you could just as well leave these pools empty, in which case, as black boxes basically, in which case the interactions with your internal activities would be shown by connecting the message flows to the pools themselves. So that's one reason why it's a good idea to always leave some space between the pools, so you have room for attaching those message flow connectors. Now regular swim lanes, you can just dock them one next to one another, but with pools it's better to leave a little bit of space. Now the message flows, if we look at them in particular, right, you notice that there's a message reference tag value that goes back to a message definition. So again, we have a formal link between the message flow connector and its actual payload. So we know exactly what's going across the wire there. Now other points of note in this diagram are a sub-process, you see step 5.10 there, and the call activity, 5.30. Now call activity is basically a stand-in or proxy for calling a reusable process or sub-process. So in this case, we're actually calling the sub-process that we defined in our reusable catalog. So the way you're going to define a call activity is by setting 2 properties. The first one is a call activity that you see being set to true, and that is what produces that thick borderline around the element to graphically mark it as a call activity. The second thing we're going to do is set the call activity ref, so the reference back to the actual process that we're calling, in this case sub-process. So it's very important not to just drag and drop in your diagrams these shared elements directly, because that will break their reusability, right, by bringing them into your context. You always want to create a proxy that represents the element in a given context. Now what we'd like to do is the proxy, when we double click it, to automatically take us to that call process diagram, the one we just saw in the reusable section. Let's validate order, there it is. So we open it up, we see the diagram that we would like to link to. Now, you notice there's another use there of a data object called customer agreement. Of course, once again, we should find that in our reusable section. So in order for this drill down to work, what we have to do, we have to go through some steps at the call activity level. The first thing we need to do is right-click it, select New Child Diagram, and then click Select Composite Diagram. And then just navigate to the actual child diagram of the reusable element that we're calling. So there it is. And we pick it as our target. That is what enables us to double-click and then jump to this diagram. The diagram could be anywhere in the model. Now, another item of interest is the little envelope marker you see on the message flows. So that is an optional decorator. Can be made visible by going to the Message Visible tag. There it is. And in the drop-down, you have to choose between initiating and non-initiating. So initiating implies a message that starts a conversation. Non-initiating is used for messages that are a result of that initial interaction. So for example, a reply message. Now when we double-click the sub-process, we're going to drill down to, of course, the next level in our process flow. But before we do that, let's go back a step and let's take a look at the parent diagram for a second and notice the numbering scheme that was used there, 5.10, 520, etc. So these are manually assigned numbers defined in a field called partition in the property window there. But if you open up the actual dialog box properties, then you'll notice that the same field is called alias. So sometimes referenced as alias, sometimes as partition. So in order to make the numbers visible in the diagram, because it will not be by default, you have to also set a property at the diagram level in the tab there, and you say use alias if available. Now before we drill down into the subprocess again, note its number, 5.10. And in this diagram, basically what I did is pulled the subprocess element back into its own child diagram, made it larger to fit the contents inside the frame. So you don't have to do this, obviously, but it does facilitate seeing your parent name and also the number. And then, of course, the internal activities of the subprocess would continue the numbering scheme, typically by adding another indent. So in this case, 10 and then 20 increments. Now, before we drill down into the next level subprocess, notice there's a error intermediate event here. So if we look at its tag values, we're going to see that there's a error ref definition. And that definition again points us back into an error that was declared in the reusable catalog. So this is yet another place that you'll leverage your catalog. Now in the final level of the process flow, the same technique was used to show the parent subprocess. And of course, the numbering scheme will continue with yet another indent. 5, 10, 10, 20, etc., etc. Now notice there is also a fee matrix data object, which again is defined from the shared artifact section. And there's also an error event there, which is basically again using the same error definition that we saw earlier. So this error event will throw the error and the previous diagram would catch it. Now a final thing we want to draw attention to is basically the hyperlink at the top left corner there back to the parent diagram. So these can be added manually to each subprocess diagram, and that is what will allow you to very easily navigate back up and down the chain of process flows. This is very useful for complex models with many levels of subprocessing. Now another useful technique is to make lanes and poles not graphically selectable. It's important not to do this too early because some of the quick linker functionality will stop working. But once you have all the elements in the lane, you can basically do that safely and then use the mouse to select the elements in the lane like I'm doing here. And you can move them around, but you will not be upsetting the entire diagram. So the lane stays put and you can just move the elements that you need. Now, If we look at the structure in our project browser, let's scroll down to take a look at that. We're going to see that we have a very clean organizational structure with, at the top, the business process element, completely encapsulating the flow. And at the top level, we're going to see just 3 pools, the 3 pools that we see on the diagram. And then if we open up the internal pool, you're going to see the production lane, single lane. And within that lane, all the internal activities, including, of course, the first level sub-process, which has, again, 1 lane. So here's that sub-process, and its single lane. And then if we continue the expansion, we see the final level sub-process with 2 lanes. So all the elements are contained either in a pool or a lane. And so it's important to make sure that the elements are not just graphically looking good, but that the underlying structure in the database is sound in terms of parent-child relationships, because that is what will allow you to run reports showing which activities are performed by which participants and roles. And so we can illustrate that by launching the search interface. We'll do that here in a second. And performing a search that will basically give us reports on how the steps are performed by the different roles and lanes. So here's the search interface. We are performing a custom search, find BPMN activities by role. And now if we look at our shared role definitions that we have in the catalog, we have 2 roles there. So let's take a look and see what is mapped to the sales department. So we have 1 activity that came from the process diagram we just looked at, plus a few other test ones that I have in this repository. We can also look at the production department, which should have a few more. And so if we now select a row in the report, then we can use the tool's Find in Project Browser shortcut key to very easily find the activity and its context. So we can know exactly where that mapping is applied. And so a report like this will allow us to validate the model and ensure the activity to role assignments are correct. And so the first column here just represents the lane names as actually used in the models. So if people used synonyms or changed the names, we can find that out here. In this case, the default name was kept. And then if we look at the 4th column there, we see that the role name is basically as defined in the shared artifacts catalog. So if we now return to one of our process diagrams, and I'm going to select the update status activity, I want to illustrate the element discussion feature of Enterprise Architect 11. So let's assume that while working on this diagram, I noticed that a colleague has posted a question relating to this step. And John, in this case, is asking whether this updated status is communicated back to the reseller. Now, if I know the answer to the question, I can right-click his question and post a reply. So let's assume in this case that we are passing the status field back. So you simply just start typing. It's a very easy edit interface. And so at this point, I can consider the discussion complete, and I can change its status to being closed. Of course, I can also post my own questions here as a discussion topic. Perhaps I would like to know if anybody has a list of these status values available. And then hopefully somebody will get back to me, maybe John, with an answer later on. So the key thing to see here is that these discussions are maintained on a per element basis. And this is what allows you as a team to exchange information within a very specific context. The other thing to notice is that the tool maintains a history or log of all the discussions that have taken place around the element. So that will give you some background information. It's a feature of version 11 that can be used, of course, not just in the context of BPMN, but it is applicable across the board. All the elements in the tool can be leveraged that way. Now, what we're going to do next is look back at our catalogs and see that we have a little library, an application library there. So what we'd like to do now is map these applications to the activities defined in our process model here. So the typical technique for doing this in Enterprise Architect is to use the relationship matrix. So in this case, I pre-built a profile to make this a little bit faster for mapping the applications to the process steps. And then what we're going to be doing is dropping the business process view package as the source and filter on the activities, of course. And then we'll do the same thing. We're going to be dropping the applications library package from the project browser. And then drop that as a target, like that. And then, of course, filter it to just the application elements. So we're building traceability here using UML dependency relationships. And the direction in this case indicates source to target, meaning that the activities depend on the applications for their realization. Now note that I could have also used the realization UML connector with a reverse direction. Either one would have been fine to express the same meaning. Now some of the mappings are already defined here, but of course we can add a few more. Like for example, update status, right, is potentially realized by the application C in whole or in part. Update customer order, right, same thing with application D, for example. Right, so far we just demonstrated standard relationship matrix functionality. Now what's been added in version 11 is the ability to create elements from within the matrix. For example, let's just say that we notice there's an application E missing from our library. We can now create it from within the matrix itself, since Enterprise Architect does have all the information needed to do so, right? So it knows where to go create it, and of course it knows the element type to create. So we just add an application E here, if you spell it correctly. And, oops, I actually created another application D, sorry about that. But you'll see it immediately being added to the matrix. So immediately, as well as to the project browser, we can start using it right away. And we'll add one more relationship there. So this is a very cool addition to what is already one of the best features of Sparx Enterprise Architect to begin with. So now that we have this matrix built, let's see how we could graphically represent the result set, for example, through a dashboard. Now, dashboards are part of version 11. And so let me go open up a folder there for dashboards. And we'll see that it has a specific diagram type and specific toolbox, just for that purpose. So if we open up the toolbox, we'll see that there's a predefined set of charts offered by the tool. And in this specific case, I used a standard chart for the graphic on the left, and I used a model view for the one on the right in your diagram there. So if we look at the definition, the one on the left, we see it's a 2D bar chart supported by a SQL query. So this graph basically illustrates the mapping of our process steps to the applications, what we just did in the relationship matrix. And we see in this case that application D is the most critical one in terms of realizing our business process. Now in the view on the right, the same information is presented, but in a report format. So now specifically we can see each activity to application mapping. So if we notice on the left, application D has 6 dependencies to it. Right, we're going to of course see the same dependencies there on the right. And then from within the model view, we can easily find the actual steps, process steps being performed that are dependent on this application, and we can find them in their context by looking them up in the project browser. I could also have brought up the diagrams from here. Right? Or we can bring up the property sheet, etc. So this chart representation and the report view are really fantastic new additions to the feature set of Enterprise Architect. And I look forward to using them extensively. Thank you for your attention.